Unfortunate dropout. He got into.
Good afternoon.
He's a dropout.
Right, that's great.
My name is Ron Prescott, and I'm from the Los Angeles schools, and I'm going to moderate the panel today of what I believe are experts with this issue. And we're going to start with Julian Betts, who's going to set a background for the discussion, and then we'll go to the other speakers. Each one will have 10 minutes, and at the end we're going to wrap up with questions and answers. So Julian, why don't you start?
Hey, well, good afternoon. Can you all hear me? Good. I'd like to start this afternoon by talking about the premise of this session, is public education fixable? Well, that implies that schools are broken. And to what extent is that true? I think you can look at that question in a number of different ways. Certainly, if you look at it in terms of test scores, there is an issue in California schools. What I'm showing you here is test scores from the National Assessment of Educational Progress for grade 8 students in reading and math. In math. And what you see there is that both in 1990 and in 1996, California students lagged national averages by a fairly wide margin. And I think that is a reason for concern. There's a silver lining in this graph, obviously. If you look at it, California students are improving in achievement. And in fact, by 1996, are more or less at the national average for 1990. But we cannot dismiss the size of that gap. Well, one thing I think that's important to get down at the beginning, I'm sure that other members of the panel would agree with me on this, you cannot take that test score gap and immediately blame teachers and schools for it. One of the reasons is that the socioeconomic traits of students in California are quite different from students in the rest of the country. Probably the most important socioeconomic trait in terms of learning at school is language ability. And this spring Stanford 9 test, which I'm showing you here, really demonstrates this fairly clearly. This was given to every student in the state. These first blue bars, which I'm showing you here, for reading and math, show the percentage of students who were at or above national norms in reading and math. 46% for reading, even lower, 42% in math. But it's quite striking, once you separate students who are limited English proficient and those who are not, you see quite different patterns. The reddish bars here are showing the non-LEP students. They're slightly above national norms in reading and fairly close to national norms in math. It's very important that we understand the challenges that California schools, teachers, and students are jointly facing. Well, is California spending too little, given this test score gap? And in particular, given the focus of this conference on Proposition 13, we need to ask the question, what did Proposition 13 do to spending? I think this figure is fairly enlightening in that regard. This shows spending per pupil in real terms, in other words, after accounting for inflation. Up until the passage of Prop 13, California was right at the national average in terms of spending per pupil. Immediately following that, you begin to see a gap opening up with some fairly rough years in the early 1990s for California. So it's clearly the case that California is spending below the national average. I'd like to make another point, though, with this figure, and that is to point out that it's somewhat misguided to talk about the halcyon days of school spending in California in the 70s or 60s. We, in fact, are spending more in real terms per pupil now than we were in any year in the 1970s or in any earlier decade. Well, given that California has this gap in spending, and given that the political environment right now is clearly conducive to large increases in spending, what does research indicate about where we should go? Should we be spending on reducing class sizes? Should we be spending it on training teachers, and so on? Probably many of you are aware of a large body of research which looks at test scores or gains in test scores as a function of school inputs. The vast majority of this research has found that school spending either has no effect on outcomes or has positive effects, but effects which are fairly modest, actually. I'll talk at some length about class size reduction later. My reading of this research is that if you're looking for a magic bullet, you will not find one, but perhaps things such as spending on teacher training, spending on increasing length of the school year, minutes per week on math during the week, things like that are likely to be much more effective than simple reductions in class size. There's another body of work which I've been involved in for about 7 or 8 years, and that asks the question, well, if it's true that school spending doesn't have a large impact on student achievement, perhaps it has a profound impact on students later on after they leave school and enter the labor market. So there have been a number of studies now which look at earnings of people after they leave school as a function of how well educated teachers were at the student school and so on. This set of research is quite similar. They're very mixed results. The most optimistic of the results show a fairly low rate of return to school spending, on the order of 2 to 3%. And to put that in context, keeping a kid in school for 1 extra year has a rate of return 3 to 4 times higher. So school spending probably does confer benefits on individuals after they grow up and enter the labor market, but we need to be realistic about the size of those benefits. Well, what should California be doing? As you probably know, there's been a flood of reforms in the last couple of years in California. Are we moving in the right direction? And do the reforms fit the prescription made by some of the education research over the last 2 decades? And let me begin here by talking about the evidence on class size. In terms of increases in spending, the recent K through 3 class size reduction is far and away the biggest source of increased demands on state coffers. There was an experiment done in Tennessee, which is probably the most persuasive evidence we have yet that class size does matter, and I'd like to spend a few minutes talking about it. In this experiment, students were put into one of 3 groups. The control group, so to speak, had regular size classes, about 23 students. A second type of class had the same class size but had a teacher's aide. The third group had small classes, 15 students instead of 23. And children were followed from kindergarten through grade 3. The main result from this study is that children in the smaller classes did do better. But most of the gains, as you'll see in a minute, really accrued to children in kindergarten, and the gains are not large. So again, I'm trying to drive home the idea that we need to be realistic here about what class size reduction and other types of spending increases can and cannot do. Here are the results for math. They're very similar to the results for reading. So what I'm showing you here is test scores at the end of the school year for the 3 groups in Tennessee, kindergarten through grade 3. The red line is the so-called control group, the regular size classes. The first thing that's going to jump out at you is the blue line, small classes, is uniformly higher. So kids in smaller classes in this experiment were doing better. Interestingly, this group here, regular size classes with a teacher aide, are statistically indistinguishable from regular classes. So teachers' aides, according to this experiment, did not help student achievement in math particularly. 2 other things I want to point out to you from this figure. First is, look down here at kindergarten. You see the gain from class size reductions occurring right away in kindergarten. You don't see that gap really widening in the later grades. The second thing that I think really stands out, if you look at this figure for a few minutes, is how close students are in the regular classes and the smaller classes at grade 3. So I did a little thought experiment here. What would happen if you took these kids in regular classes, who are represented by this red line, how much longer would you have to keep them in school at the end of grade 3 to the point where they would catch up in achievement to this point, where the small classes were at the end of grade 3? Well, you can do that for yourself. You can extend that red line outward and upward. It turns out that you'd have to keep those kids in school about an extra 0.15 to 0.2 of a school year. And distributed over 4 years, that's really not much at all. So you can do a kind of back-of-the-envelope calculation and to basically figure out how cost-effective reducing class size is compared to other reforms such as increasing the length of the school year. What I found from this exercise was that for math, increasing the length of the school year was about 9 times as cost-effective as class size reductions if they're carried out over kindergarten through grade 3. I did this for the reading results as well for Tennessee, and the other results, as you can see, were even more dramatic. So to me, the bottom line from this experiment is that class size reductions can work. Most of the benefits seem to accrue in kindergarten, and something I haven't told you is that the benefits accrue particularly to disadvantaged students. To me, the most important thing is that perhaps other reforms, such as increasing length of the school year, would be far more beneficial than reducing class size. And yet this experiment has been used, ironically, throughout the country as a rationale for reducing class size. Well, where do we go from there? It's not clear what other reforms are the best to implement. One thing I want to point out in the few minutes I have left is that California has had a whole set of quite radical reforms over the last couple of years. Many of them, I think, are terrific. One thing that has tended to suffer here is a holistic view of education. Most of these reforms are isolated, piecemeal reforms, and sometimes these can have unintended side effects. And I'll just cite to you the one most obvious example. The K-3 class size reduction has led to an unprecedented increase in the percentage of teachers in our schools who were there on emergency credentials. And that's not a good thing. So we need to think about things like integrating class size reductions with increasing teacher training and coming up with the right incentives to increase the flow of people into teachers' colleges. Just very quickly in closing, what does work? I think that some of the most promising things are standards combined with remediation, and as you may know, California has taken some very important steps in this direction. Perhaps if there's time later, we can talk about the need to spend a lot on remediation. My feeling is that the recent legislation to end social promotion, the money allocated for remediation that goes along with that is a small fraction of what is going to be truly needed if these are going to be serious standards. Teacher training, expanded length of the school year, or added hours in the school day are likely to be somewhat effective. Neither is a magic bullet. Class size reduction can help as well, but it's probably the least effective of the three. Something that I know two of the other panelists are going to talk about at some length is school choice, vouchers, charter schools, and so on. I think that there's certainly a role for there. There's a role for increasing competition between schools for students. I think we need to know a lot more about what vouchers, and in particular charter schools, can and cannot do. I'd like to close with making the most fervent plea I possibly can in the 5-10 seconds left to me for really changing the culture of how we implement reforms in California. It should become absolutely standard that when the state is considering spending $300 million on increasing length of the school year or $1.5 billion a year on reducing class size, that some portion of those funds be set aside for independent evaluations and field studies. Instead of implementing something across the whole state at once, implement it in some schools within a district and do controlled quantitative studies. I don't think it's right that a state as big as California should be relying solely on experiments from states such as Tennessee, simply because the population of our students is so distinct. I'll stop there.
Thank you very much, Julian. For a person with my background who's in a large school district in Los Angeles and has spent a lot of time, 25 years in Sacramento, working on educational policy, this is dreamland. We'd like to have you multiplied by 80 and sort of standing in front of every door, and when they walk through Education Committee, talk to them. Pam, co-director of the Center for School Reform, she probably has the answers we need.
Yeah, there you go. Well, Julian was very kind and sort of led into what I'm asked to speak about today, and I do want to speak about charter schools in particular, and maybe just a little bit about other school choice strategies like vouchers. I only have a little bit amount of time, so I want to outline just a few general motifs and some of the things that I think that are important about charter schools policy, and then Charlie, who's actually a charter school director and is on the firing line, can probably tell us how it's really working. Suffice it to say that the charter school movement is growing apace. There's 28 states and the District of Columbia have some sort of charter school law. People like me who track it, we sort of divide the laws into effective and ineffective, or strong versus weak. Primarily, and we judge that on how many charter schools are created and the kind of changes that it makes in the system. There's more than 800 public charter schools nationwide. There's 130 in California. Most of these have waiting lists for students who want to enroll, and surprisingly, even a larger waiting list proportionally of teachers who want to work at the school. The first crop of California's charter school hasn't passed an important benchmark. Many schools have had their charters renewed by their sponsoring district. In Los Angeles, I know you just had a big round of charter renewals, and the process went very smoothly. Also, California's charter law was strengthened and reformed during this last legislative session. Some important reforms like raising the cap on the number of schools that can operate in the state and within a district, making it easier for charter schools, especially startup charter schools, to form, reducing the amount of administrative money that a district can levy, and hopefully maybe try to figure out some way to get the money directly to charter schools rather than bypass the district, because that has caused some obstacles. The one thing that it did not do, and which is a serious problem, is not, but this is the same for the public school system as a whole, is it did not address the facilities question. And that is another big problem for charter schools. So, to get to maybe some broad cloth conclusions about charter schools, I'd like to rephrase the question that was asked at this panel. It's not, is public education fixable? I think maybe the more interesting question is who's going to fix it?
That's good.
And it actually reminds me of a story of a famous school reformer from East Harlem 4, Cy Flegel, who started one of the first massive, large public school choice programs in the 70s. And he was out here in California with me, and I was taking him around to some charter schools. And we stopped at a gas station in Sonoma, and, you know, Cy's a typical New Yorker, rumpled suit, but I was dressed in heels, and we looked a little out of place in this little gas station. So the gas station attendant, according to Cy, says, well, what are you folks doing out here? And he says, well, you know, we've come to look at some schools, and we want to talk about how to fix them. And so there's two ways you can do that. One is the natural way, and one is the miraculous way, this gas station attendant says. So says, oh yeah, well, how do you do that? He says, well, the natural way is a band of angels comes down and fixes the schools. The miraculous way is we fix them ourselves. And and that's exactly what I think charter school developers have been doing. I mean, they've been performing some miracles. And that is the first charter school principle, that somebody other than a school district can start and run a public school. And that means parents, groups of teachers, not-for-profit community organizations like Urban League, cities or municipalities. For instance, in Florida, whole cities have started sponsoring charter schools because they have county-wide districts, and there's a lot of little cities within these counties, and they don't feel they're being served. For-profit corporations have done a lot of research and development and are starting to run what I call EMOs, or education management organizations, where they contract to do all the services, the hiring, and managing the school for a not-for-profit group. I think the second most important idea is that charter schools are schools of choice. And the theory of choice, basically, I think you're probably mostly aware of it, but it rests on sort of two principles. First, choice can work by providing equal opportunity. It allows more choices and gives students and their families more ability to exercise choice. And then the theory goes, as parents rationally exercise their choice, schools will be held accountable for the results. That's the theory. We can discuss it later. And then secondly, it'll improve academic achievement by increasing the amount of choices schools will compete. And then in conjunction with exercise of parents' preferences and accountability, it'll encourage innovation and the development of new and better teaching and learning strategies. I think that is important because I don't think there's any shortage of innovations in the public school system. It's just who measures them and how are they implemented. And as Julian said, it can be quite costly when you make one huge single mistake. Well, when you've got a bunch of different types of schools and strategies being implemented, they're on a smaller scale, and the costs are not quite as high if they don't work. Our panel's second question was, is it possible to implement management reforms? And will that be enough? And I think Julian has probably directed the question. I certainly believe no. I think that we are in have somewhat of a crisis on our hands. Also, you can't just look at it in terms of status quo. I mean, our society is changing. And I think our schools can't just stand still and maintain the status quo. They're going to have to change rather rapidly, too. So what I think what we need is a manageable education revolution. But most school reforms, as do charter schools and the principle of school choice, rest on certain values. One is that the reform will be system-wide, that it will create some system-wide change. It'll be comprehensive and maybe hopefully based on some research. And then third, that issues of individual equity and group equity will also be considered, and the effects on the individual and the group won't be adverse and hopefully will be helpful. So let me talk about some of the things how I think charter schools and school choice fit into those values. A sound charter policy, one that promotes a high degree of system-wide choice and change and comprehensive school reform, is very important. A lot of us in the charter school movement hear that, well, you're only creating little specialized schools, little boutique schools. As I said, there's 130 charter schools in California, but we have more than almost 8,000 schools. So, I mean, we're less than 0.5%. And it's very hard to create any momentum and impact on the system if we don't get more schools. Second thing is that a law has to be crafted, and I think our new law will help a little bit, but these schools have to have a great deal of autonomy and flexibility in order to be able to create the changes they need. And anyone who's tried to get a charter in this state knows that's very difficult. I think that we have to, California's been very lucky in that a lot of our schools are conversion schools. There are some states that don't allow this. And this is extraordinarily important, especially for the equity issue, which I'll talk about later. And this is a revolutionary part. I mean, parents, teachers, community groups should be able to seize, capture schools, especially in poor neighborhoods and in low-performing districts. And our law does allow for that. You know, the district is supposed to give greater attention to at-risk populations and low-performing schools. Unfortunately, I don't think no one has really addressed the problem of how that really happens. There's a couple of not-for-profit groups operating in the state that are really trying to get some charter schools started in the inner city, but I think it's a little bit more difficult for those people. As I said, I think you need to increase, if you increase the number of schools, you'll get some kind of saturation, and then you can really start seeing some system-wide changes. In Mesa, Arizona, for instance, I would say, I think it's almost up to 20% of their schools are charter. And you have seen some enormous impacts on how the district has reacted to that. Arizona is a state where they don't necessarily provide kindergarten. But this is one of Richard Rodriguez's Go West Young Men type states, and there's a large growing population of Easterners whose kids have always gone to kindergarten. And they demanded and demanded from the district that the district do it, and the district didn't. Well, all of a sudden, all these charter schools start popping up, and they're providing kindergarten. Next thing you know, big advertisements in the Mesa, Arizona paper from the public schools talking about the kindergarten they're providing and come back to the schools. And they actually did see some parents going from the charter school to their neighborhood school. I think we have to allow also regular district schools to change somewhat in response. I mean, in some sense, I think all schools eventually should be charter schools. But as certain reforms start working, and we see it in charter schools, we should try and maybe relax our education code to allow those kind of changes to filtrate into the main system. I think charter schools should try and match most of the state education reforms, especially like, for instance, maintaining standards, taking the STAR test, and I think that's an important measure of how they're doing. I think there should try to be some coordination with school districts and community. If these charter schools are totally independent and not operating with the district, they're going to be like little viruses. And what happens when a body has a virus? Well, boom. So we really need to have some policies in place. I mean, charter schools should get the same amount of money in terms of when new legislation is passed, instead of us having to fight for trying to get, well, yeah, we should get the class size reduction money, or we should get this summer school money, we should get this. And the same way, you know, charter school people should be going to the in-staff meetings in school districts, and vice versa. Charter schools could serve as labs and teacher training for district teachers. So these are things that we really need to have in place. So the second category, how am I doing in time, okay?
Well, another 2 minutes.
Okay, second category that I wanted to talk about, and it's very important to me, and something that I think is one of the primary issues that we're talking about, should worry about, especially in this state, as Richard Rodriguez said, and that's the idea of individual and group equity. This gets back to my original question, well, so who should fix the schools? In this light, we should allow the widest group of charter developers as possible, including private and not-for-profit organizations. There's a very interesting group called Options for Youth. It's running about 7 or 8 charter schools. I think there's one in Los Angeles now. 7 to 8 charter schools throughout the state. They've actually gone national. They're going to run 5 or 6 in Washington, D.C. And basically what they are is they are dropout recovery group. And it's they've had great success in taking dropouts that districts don't even know about sometimes, bringing them back in. Many of those students go back into the regular district program, but the Options for Youth also has an independent study program where they can actually finish their degree and continue on to college or into the workplace. Districts like this because it's financially, it's not a drain on them, and it works out. They are recovering students that they weren't collecting money on. Options for Youth can, because they use the independent study model and are very efficient, can educate these kids rather quickly and rather inexpensively, actually, and then get them back into the main system. I think another very important policy here is that we have to make sure that parents, especially in low-income communities, and where English maybe is not the primary language, but we train parents to become informed and active choosers, and because otherwise they will be left behind. I also believe that not only should we allow the widest variety of charter school developers to exist, but we should actually provide startup funds and have a lot of education programs and outreach to community organizations to tell them about the charter school possibility and to train them, give them workshops on how to start their own school. Finally, the charter school idea, I think, is a mechanism by which parents and teachers can develop and implement a public school with specialized curriculum and based on distinct values and teaching and learning styles. This can include core knowledge, Paideia, Montessori, an African-American school, or I have Native American here, but I'll say American Indian school. There is an American Indian school in Oakland. New types of schools could create alternative teaching methods, home study, for instance. About 1/3 of our charter schools offer distance learning and home study options. One of my favorite schools is a 1,600 student charter school just north of, I guess east here, Lincoln. Operates out of Lincoln, and it serves about 1,200 families in 6 counties. And they hire regular public school teachers from districts within these 6 counties to be learning consultants. So in a way, these teachers are moonlighting. And they're paid on contract to monitor the student and create an individual education plan. Parents have banded together to have group classes. They're using distance learning, satellite learning. I was there a day that There's about 60 or 70 teachers got their laptop computers, and some of these teachers are in rather remote communities, and I know that a lot of teachers don't get access to computers in those communities, so that was a benefit for the teachers. These new schools and policies should be designed to foster, based on the assumption that different groups in society have a right to develop and choose a type of school and curriculum they feel best fits their children and maybe even their particular belief system. Policies that ensure this value are: one, training, education, and resources, as I said, not only on how to choose a school, but how to start a school. I think we could target geographic areas where we find that certain types of schools, for instance, schools that specialize in teaching language in a special way. Very controversial subject, I know, in California. And again, I think that maybe if we gave first emphasis and preference to conversion charter schools in low-performing or poverty-stricken communities where there's a real emphasis. For instance, one of the popular methods in charter schools is using direct instruction methods, and that have been very successful in teaching low-income kids to read. So the risk is completely sidetracking. If we really embrace this value of individual and group equity, I think that we need to consider that we're also talking about the right to a family to send their child to a religious school. And if we talk about that, then we have to talk not about charter schools, because those are public schools, but we're talking about some kind of voucher or tax credit. In this sense, school choice becomes a civil right. It becomes a matter of justice. Every family should be free to choose the most appropriate school for their child. In an open society and pluralistic system, especially one that Richard Rodriguez describes, is going to have to provide more justice to our citizens without discrimination due to race, income, or religion. So this will mean, I think we should start first crafting strategies to help low-income parents who might want their child to attend a religious school, but because of income can't, like middle-class or wealthier parents can do. And there's two places where they're starting to implement this policy. One is in Milwaukee, and in fact, probably next week, actually this week, it's going to the U.S. Supreme Court about whether the Milwaukee plan, which provides vouchers to public schools and to religious school students who are attending public or religious schools, and that will be decided very shortly. But whether religious schools are included or not in this mixture, and when we're talking about creating individual schools, I think there's still some important questions. What would we do about single-gender schools, for instance? And if a voucher system was implemented, would we prohibit religious schools except a public voucher from requiring specific religious behavior of students who enroll? I mean, after all, they're taking tax funding. So these are difficult questions, but I think they're ones that we're going to have to address sooner than later, and we're on uncharted waters here. The last thing I want to do is that maybe we should also expand our vision of what public schools mean. I believe, obviously, from what I've just said, that a public school does not necessarily mean that the government has to run the school, that we could expand to include the private sector, maybe what Peter Drucker has called the third sector, into our public school system. Thanks.
Thanks, Pam. We're going to have questions after the panel's completed, and I have some.
Yeah, I bet.
Michael is a professor of education at Stanford University and co-director of PACE, Policy Analysis in California Education, and he's also one of the people that's going to save the LA public schools. Michael.
Thanks. I'm going to change here to Julian because I have some
Okay.
few overheads. My remarks will be addressed to state policy because this topic is vast, and so I'm going to talk a little bit about the state. I'm going to first sketch in some recent trends in state policy very quickly, and then I'm going to revisit a 10-point plan which my organization, Policy Analysis for California of Education, put out in 1995. We're a joint program with Stanford University University of California at Berkeley, and we have a Sacramento office with Jerry Hayward here in Sacramento. So to get at where we are with the state policy and how to talk about rethinking it, here's some trends recently. Education emerges as the #1 state political issue. We all know about that. Second has been a continual loss of state confidence in local education officials. The low scores in the National Assessment of Educational Progress, we finished tied with Louisiana for last in the National Assessment reading, led, and among other things, to a view that local educators could not be trusted to teach reading well, emphasize phonics enough. The governor's aide, Maureen DeMarco, talked about fuzzy crap as the math curriculum. Sometimes it's called wacko math. I mean, there's just an intense dispute and view that the locals have sort of been too far to the left, and we need to get Big Daddy from the state to bring them back in and control them in a more curricular way. And so we've had a new push then of loss of confidence on top of the earlier loss of confidence by the Democratic legislators in earlier years in the 70s, where they lost confidence in the local officials to handle problems with disadvantaged children and racial and ethnic minorities. That led to the perceived need for the state to become more directive, so that the recent policies have followed on the Proposition 13 era of lots of specific earmarked funds. Don't put the money on the local table because the teachers will take it in salaries. We have to tie it up in very specific things. All of this is fed into a state governance system which is extremely fractured and contentious. The most recent example of that is that the governor cut $8 million out of the operating budget of the Department of Education. This would defund all the managers, all the management level of the department. And the board and the department have been at odds with each other. And you have the California Teacher Commission working with teachers, which is an independent group. So you have a state governance system which is highly fractured, and the relations between K-12 and post-secondary are very, very, very weak. Now, more recently, what we've seen is that Governor Wilson has been exerting the strong prerogatives of his office and begun a battle and continue to battle in some ways with the California Teachers Association. Proposition 8 has several things in it which the California Teachers Association does not care for, and indeed the general focus has been for those two to be at odds, and that has led to even more categorical initiatives as the economy has generated surplus revenue. So this year we had after school, we had library books, we had textbooks, we had social promotion, we had longer school year, the list goes on. The Education Coalition is fighting on many fronts. It's confronted with initiatives such as the 226 to end union dues, which Governor Wilson pushed very hard, and it also is involved in disputes on many fronts, and therefore has had trouble focusing, and I think may have difficulty defeating Proposition 8 in the fall, Governor Wilson's initiative. Now this end of this is, as I put it, no overall strategy guides these numerous state policy changes. We tend to have a set of what I call widgets du jour. Whatever idea seems to be hot, if it's social promotion, we lay that on. If it's particular types of testing, we lay that on. And with these contentious factors, you have a bunch of programs with no clear strategy. Proposition 8 would add to this by creating an inspector general of education who would inspect all schools at least once every 2 years. That's on the one hand, and inspect them towards state standards. On the other hand, would be control by community-based groups, school site-based of parents who would control the curriculum and make important decisions on budget allocations. And these school site councils presumably could go in a different direction in their curriculum views from the state's views on what its assessment and what its standards should be. So we have, I think, a need to step back and say, what is a strategy to fix the schools? And class size is, of course, the largest one of those, which Julian mentioned, which I'm going to come back to briefly in the end. Well, that brings me back to the paper we did called Rebuilding the Golden State, and we did it in 1995. And we had a 10-point plan, and as professor, I usually tell people, beware of reformers with 10-point plans. But here it is, and it'll help you, I think, focus on some of the changes very briefly. We recommend to develop a set of measurable statewide educational goals, a set of expectations for students, and a set of guideposts for teachers and administrators, and develop a new student assessment system to replace the class test, which was one of the things which led to loss of confidence in local educators. Well, we're some ways on that. We have developed new content standards in curriculum content, and we have not yet, however, developed a new assessment that ties to that content. And we have the STAR test, which is an off-the-shelf test, which is supposed to be a temporary test, and at this point is trying to be broadened to develop the content. But a crucial thing to fix the schools from, I think, a standpoint of the state is to get clear the state's view about what students should know and be able to do. Right now, it's exceedingly contentious, and we need to resolve the content standards and bring more support to them, and we need to develop a new assessment which is aligned to them. And I would add, we need to think about post-secondary education's admissions and freshman placement standards and how they align with elementary secondary. We have 50% of our pupils who go directly from high school to the California State University who need remedial education. Now, you obviously don't have clear up and down the line expectations or communication of standards. Next, we recommended that a way to move forward teacher competence was to revitalize pre-service and in-service teacher education to ensure that all California's teachers must meet a set of standards of professional competence. We have a whole set of bills which passed, which are promising, which help to revitalize pre-service education. They're putting us into the business of undergraduate education for teachers, the first time since the middle 1960s. I think it's a smart move. We can't possibly do it all in a fifth year. It took a state 30 years to figure that out, but we got there. And the new teacher standards also are presumably to be aligned with the student assessment standards. Whether that'll happen, I don't know. But we're making some inroads here. On the other hand, we have a set of universities who are difficult to change in terms of their faculties, and we have a system of professional development for teachers which is shallow and tends to be very weak in clinical follow-up of what the teachers have heard in these in-service workshops, meaning coaching and follow-up. So a lot of work to be done there. But as I indicated, a lot's going on because of the state's economy generating these areas. Next area we recommend was provide incentives for a new teacher salary schedule based on demonstrated professional skill and knowledge. The salary schedule in education came roughly into this system in 1924 to 26. There aren't many places in the American economy that run the same salary schedule they ran in 1924. But we do. Number of years of service and number of credits beyond the BA. So we have a lot of learning going on which is not tied into the mastery of demonstrated professional skill and knowledge. There's a lot of systems around that would pay for skill and knowledge. I'm not talking about paying for student achievement. I'm saying if you show me you can teach certain things, we will pay you more. But we've made no progress on that at this point, although the governor did propose experiments in that. And I should say we made slight progress, and it was passed this year under Governor Wilson's recommendations that all teachers who pass the National Board for Professional Teachers Standards exam, which is really a knowledge and skill test of a high level given nationally, will get a $10,000 bonus. That passed the legislature, not very heralded in the blizzard of bills that went through, but I think sets an important precedent. We need to build on that. Our next one was set as a goal that all California students achieve English proficiency and provide resources, financial and pedagogical, so that school districts can achieve the goal. Well, I don't know what to say about that one. We passed a proposition. So the state did act. It acted dramatically. So it has a policy. Whether that policy will be, there will be the resources to carry out that policy, whether that is the correct policy, is unknown at this point and needs very careful evaluation, and I think that's a vital thing in our future. As we know, about 1.4 million of our children are limited English speaking. Sixth, and now which is a focus of this conference, reform the state school finance system by restoring local fiscal control, a balanced system. One of the things that Proposition 13 did was it helped equalize the system. I was president of the State Board of Education when Proposition 13 passed, and we made the decision as we bailed the local districts out, we were going to even it out, not giving Beverly Hills its full quotient money back, and it helped in that regard. So it shifted California's issues of finance from equity to adequacy. I do not believe over the long run we can have an adequate system of funding without a local component. And that our recommendation in PACE in the past, which I know is delusional, is that we have a local income tax surcharge. You could vote a surcharge on your income tax for the schools, and that would be one way of doing without revising Prop 13. Obviously, nothing much has been done there. And I want to emphasize that you read about where California is. We're either 41st or we're 36th in spending. There's a study out which has not received the publicity it needs, which adjusts California's education spending for our high costs. The current way we rank states in school spending assumes it costs as much to educate a child per dollar in Mississippi as it does here. When you adjust for the costs of California, we drop 7 to 9 places, adjusting for our high costs in a national study. So we're really well into the 40s cost adjusted. A second part of that finance recommendation was to revise the overly complicated system of categorical funding for programs. Not only haven't we revised it, we've added to it. And so we have, I don't know of any state that has the categorical melange we do. And it's, you know, we have there's 50 or 60 or so state categorical programs which are difficult to deal with. Our seventh recommendation was to intensify and expand the coordination of services between schools and other agencies that deal with children. We have made some progress on that. A lot more needs to be done. The Governor's Healthy Start program was an interesting and effective start in many ways, needs to be expanded in our view. Eighth was streamline the education code. You know, trying to set standards centrally and decentralize some of the education code, which depending on how you count it is 1,500 pages, 4,000 pages, or 7,000 pages. All I know is I had the librarian at Stanford get all the education codes out and put them around a library, around a table. The biggest one by far was California in terms of length and detail, and it seems to me we need to rethink that.
It weighs 40 pounds.
It weighs 40 pounds, okay. I mean,
weighed it.
So on the, yeah, that's the annotated, right? There's one that's that big, which I got once, but that's been added to by all the categorical programs. Lastly, next, encourage and support a well-designed system of experiments to test new ventures such as charter schools, school-based management, and things of that sort. In this regard, the charter school evaluation has been going on. And I think I agree with Pam's comments that we need to look at it very carefully and evaluate it. And lastly, we recommended formalizing interagency cooperation and legislation to link school-to-career policy with education reform. The school-to-work area is a very troubled area, still not really taking off, and still a pretty muddled area where I think we've made very little progress in thinking through the school-to-work transition. So that's my report card on our 10 points. One thing that you may want to talk about is that the PACE is part of a consortium with the American Institutes of Research and the RAND Corporation to evaluate class size, and we could talk about how to evaluate that program and how we could conceive some of the issues that Julian Betts brought up.
Thank you, Michael. We'll get back to that. Now let's go to a person that really is working on this directly, and that's Charles Leo.
Yes, hi. The question I was asked to answer is, are public charter schools a solution to fix education? Yes and no. They're not the fix or the magic bullet, as Julian was saying earlier, but charter schools have been a large step or a big step in the right direction. Now, what I don't want to do is to take your time to shine the light on our charter school, Natomas Charter School here in Sacramento, but I'd like to talk about Natomas Charter School as an example because, one, it's the one I know the most about, and two, it's a good example of what can happen when creativity is allowed to be put into action and put into practice. A little history on Natomas Charter School. 6 years ago, a colleague and I founded the charter school. We were primarily middle school teachers, not much administration experience, but we had a lot of TGIF experience where we discussed ways to improve education. What would we do if we were in a position to do things different? When the charter school law came about, we decided to give it a shot and put our money where our mouth is. And we came up with a vision of a charter school as a place where you create programs to meet student needs and try to have a place where any student who would come into our program would have somewhere to go. And of course, we had to start somewhere, and our experience was in middle school. So we actually started our charter school as an 8th grade only program. We occupied 4 classrooms basically on the campus that we taught on already. So we were a startup charter school, not a conversion. It's a little more challenging, but you have a lot more flexibility on what you do curriculum-wise and so forth. It was an interesting school year that first year. And just to give you an idea of where we've gone from there, and I'll talk about some of these programs individually. So we started with 80 8th grade students that first year, and since that time, well, 6 years later, or 5.5 years later now, we now have, and by the way, that was an 8th grade only program, we now have close to 600 students in a K-12 program, which is comprised of 3 different programs. So we've grown substantially, and I think that statement tells us that there is some potential for success there. When you have a new concept like charter schools and people enrolling to get into a school that they don't know a lot about, they're looking for something different, something that works, something new for their children. And the big thing, I believe, is choice. As Pam mentioned earlier, it's important that not only the student but the parent has choice in the education process. People rarely, we rarely experience parents or students talking about how they wish they weren't here or how their schools should be run better, because there's a place for them. They don't have to be there, and they have made a decision to be at that particular school. Compared to what I saw as a traditional teacher in public schools for 10 years previous to that, we saw very little parent involvement. The parent involvement in our programs is dramatic. We had, just by word of mouth, last week, we had an invitation to parents, not even a formal invitation, but an invitation to parents to come to a meeting to discuss parent committees. And over 100 parents showed up to that. Now, we used to have formal invitations to parent or PTA nights, and maybe a dozen parents or so would show up. These are parents who want to be in the school, they're interested in being in the school, and we do require, as many charter schools do, contracts where parents have to put in some time. So we want to establish a relationship between the student and the parent and the school. We all have to work together to make this happen. It's exciting and it's motivating to see parents and students coming together to make the school happen, to make it work. We have parents coming out of the woodwork, forming committees that I haven't even thought about. And the students are motivated to see their parents interested in education. About the programs that we have, the original program, the 8th grade only program, was converted the following year to a middle school program. And we call that our leading edge program. Its emphasis is on technology and community involvement. We do some interesting things in that program that are unique. We also recently created a independent study program 2 years ago called PACT, P-A-C-T, Pursuing Academic Choices Together, where we work with the student and the parents on independent, individualized education plans. And recently, well, last year, we created a 3rd program, the Performing and Fine Arts Academy of Sacramento. And we also had an overwhelming response to that, and it's been very successful. We're in our 2nd year now, and all of our programs do have a wait list. And keep in mind that we started, just 5.5 years ago with 80 students. Some of the benefits, again, of charter schools: one is it's a choice school. 2, having the Ed Code waive is a big thing. There's no question about that. Michael mentioned streamlining the ed code. Well, with charter schools, it's definitely streamlined. The ed code is primarily waived for charter schools. So we're able to do some really creative things and not get bogged down in the paperwork and the bureaucracy of running a school. Some of the things that you can do without this ed code, seat time is not necessary for attendance. Independent study regulations are removed. Having artists in residence, for example, are a possibility, as we do in our Performing Arts Academy. Job shadowing for our middle school students is a possibility, where students go job shadowing once a month, spend a day in the community learning something about different organizations and businesses out there. And yes, they are learning and they're getting a great deal out of it. We're not necessarily part of the collective bargaining and teachers unions. That's an option for charter schools. Teachers are taking on new roles that usually are explored or not explored unless teachers go into administration on a full-time basis. Our original program, the Leading Edge program, for example, is practically being run by itself now. The teachers have all taken on new roles and responsibilities. And when there's a teacher meeting, I'm no longer even, I'm not necessarily in attendance there. They're running the show. They're doing it all. And they're motivated and they're excited about what they're doing. And the fascinating part is it does work. One thing I wasn't planning on doing 5 years ago or 6 years ago when we started the charter school was getting involved in politics. But once you go into a charter school, you're involved in politics. There's no way around that. It can be very challenging at times. I'd much rather be spending my time on creative programs or coming up with new and interesting curriculum. And instead, often I'm involved in politics I'd rather not be involved with. And often it's very local, with the school board, for example. So no one ever should open up a charter school thinking they're not going to be a politician. Let's see here. Another issue that's of concern for charter schools, as Pam mentioned earlier, is facilities. It's a big challenge. Charter schools have to use their ADA money, their average daily attendance money, for their facilities. For example, presently, we pay rent to our district. We're the only school in the district that pays rent to the district. And that comes straight from our ADA revenue. It's unfortunate, that money could be going to textbooks, supplies, and so forth. It's understandable that we're paying rent. To some degree, we are occupying a school in a district that's a growth district. That also creates political challenges because we have quite a few out-of-district students attending our school. So we have out-of-district students utilizing in-district facilities that are paid for by local residents. That creates a problem. We're in a really bad position right now, in fact, a really bad predicament, where everything that we've created, it won't happen. I wouldn't allow it to happen, but the potential is there for the program not to even exist next year. We're in a position where the school that we are on presently is a need to be used by the district for overflow, for middle school or elementary. Who's going to be the first people to go? It's going to be the charter school. And basically we have 60% out-of-district students. It doesn't matter that it's a successful program. What matters is that in-district parents are the ones that vote for school board members. So we do have some issues, some sticky issues there. We could try to rent commercial property because we don't have to necessarily be in a, the DSA-approved buildings. And, pardon me?
Field Act.
Field Act buildings. So we have some possibilities of creating a campus on a non-school type of environment or setting. But that's another challenge that, that we're not necessarily tuned in to do. That's not our profession. So yes, there are some challenges there. There's some exciting things going on, though. We have created a real exciting program here. In fact, our scores in the district, and occasionally I'll take some time to brag about this, but the STAR test results are, we're the highest in the district. But again, it didn't matter and when it comes to the facilities issue. So we're just going to keep struggling with the facilities issues and some of the other issues that are faced by charter schools. And I'd be happy to answer any questions when it's that time.
Thank you, Charles. We have 30 minutes for questions and answers. We hope answers, yes.
I don't mean to put you on the spot, however, I feel like I'm in My daughter is in a charter school. We live in Stanislaus County.
Santa where?
Pardon me?
Where?
Stanislaus.
Stanislaus, yes.
And the school is in Sierra Plumas County.
Mm-hmm.
Combined there. And we find that we've been waiting for supplies for 6 months. And I think either we need to, because there's a rosy picture painted for charter schools, and it is an alternative, and I support that. However, I'm finding that the charter schools are not getting enough support from the government, I think, or legislative process, and, well, they can't do anything. They can't promote that process. They're not getting their supplies, because it's a circular kind of a thing. It needs to go through 3 different organizations in order to get done. What I'm saying is, either it needs to get an injection of support, or it needs to be looked at seriously. I'm wondering, you guys are familiar with this, have you experienced these problems in the beginning? Because it is a newer charter school. Are these rough periods kind of mellowed out after a while?
Well, sure, like I said earlier, the first year was quite an experience, and I wouldn't want to relive it. But that's an issue of probably management. That's probably more of a management issue. One of the first things we did was to take over the responsibilities of ordering our own supplies and getting things done, and we got it 3 times faster than a traditional method. So we usually have things within a day or 2. So there's a management issue. That's a local thing, and that can be
Is it
squared
a
away.
management issue of the charter school, or a management issue of the district, or a management issue of the state? Whose management issue is it?
Well, it's not the state, that's for sure. It's going to have to be, it's either local at the charter school level or the board level. Or it could be at the cabinet.
Well, I think that charter schools not only have to be held accountable for student performance, but I think there's a lot of different measures that people who measure the effectiveness of schools that measure. One is parent satisfaction. 2, I think very important, is fiscal management. These are public schools. They are public monies. I think another problem that's happened a lot with charter schools, and maybe it's because they're startup, and I think this happens in business too, but I'm sure it's very disturbing for a school board, the sponsoring school board, staff turnover. Especially in new schools, the people who are good at starting a school might not be the ones who are good at running the school. But this is really up to this school was sponsored by a school district, and it's up to the sponsor to do its job and to monitor that school. So your recourse as a parent, I think, is, if you can't resolve it with the school, is to go to the school district, and they have to do something about it.
Yes, ma'am.
The most intriguing thing that you said, Charles, was that your school, the teachers were not part of the collective bargaining unit. The charter school that I'm familiar with, Bowling Green in Sacramento City Unified, unfortunately, they elected to stay in their collective bargaining unit, and they've had one problem after another. They've had to negotiate. Everything they do has to be a waiver in the contract, and I think it's really bogged down their progress. I wondered how your teachers what kind of job protection do they have that they felt that they were free to leave that?
Well, 2 things there. Are you asking me about how we not be...
Well,
how-
are you
why-
agency shop in your, what?
No.
Do they have tenure? Do
No,
they have
no,
tenure
they're-
rights back
no,
then?
they don't have tenure rights.
So if something happened to that school and they folded, they would have no...
Any teacher who came from within the district, who was part of the original union, the Natomas Unified School District local union there, what is it, the Natomas Teachers Association, they have rights back into the district.
Oh, they have rights.
Well, see, our union told our teachers at Bowling Green that they did not. If they left the collective bargaining...
That's one of the elements of a charter, is that you have to address, teachers' rights, and that is one thing that I think, unfortunately, that collective bargaining units have done to thwart charter schools, is they minimize. I mean, they won't allow the teachers, and so the teachers won't.
They also have a new agreement that, in agreement for giving this charter school, Bowling Green, these waivers, they have, in essence, and I'm not sure who agreed to this, I guess the district administrators, they will never have another charter school. That was one of the trade-offs they made.
Yes,
Uh,
ma'am.
Three quick things. I'm with another district in Sacramento County that has had a charter experience. And I won't go into details or anecdotes, except to tell you that it was a middle school in a city where it was the only middle school. And my brief study of charter schools has been showing me that charter schools that are formed for a particular purpose, either curricular or fine arts, dance, whatever, have something. Ours was the only middle school in the area, so you went to that school and then they chose to completely 100% align themselves back with the district, collective bargaining,
Right.
everything. And the only thing that they supposedly offered was to increase volunteerism, if you will, and that never happened. So I hope as you all study charters, you also look at what's not working, because I'm coming away, from my experience with a very negative view towards our charter experience.
Well, we call those placeholder charter schools, and we do know who they are, I mean, which ones they are, and there's ways you can account for that.
And they chose not to renew their charter, and the board agreed. On class size reduction, I was intrigued by what you said about whether it's really worth it economically. And one of the other things that we noticed statewide is, for this benefit, we've eliminated libraries, we've eliminated computer labs, we've eliminated music rooms, and et cetera. And again, I hope that that's being looked at in the evaluation. And facilities altogether, I hope, are being looked at. I haven't heard any discussion at this conference about the dilemma California schools are in with state control of facilities. And the last thing to Mr. Kirst, I have a fear of some of the things I hear talked about, that sometimes in California we're sort of falling into this dumbing down that you hear of, and when we always talk to the whole and we always talk to the big group, we have tons of state mandates for the either the lesser advantaged economically or the poor learners. What's going on in California for those kids that want to go to Ivy League colleges and want to be doctors and professors and sitting where you're sitting someday?
Well, basically what's going on in California for those pupils is they get through and they start very early in an honors track. They do well, obviously, in elementary, and then they're in a sort of another education system of honors and advanced placement. The advanced placement, yeah, depends where, but the advanced placement numbers in the state have been, doubling and going up at a very large amount. My guess is the legislature will begin to support advanced placement in terms of fees and teacher training and expand it. There's about 38 states that have a large program to enhance advanced placement through state funding, and I know that's under study now. But that, if they're not in that kind of a system, they're in somewhat of a difficult straits. So you've created a para-educational system that goes as early as the 8th grade. Because to get into UC, where they weight, as people know, advanced placement more and honors more, I mean, you've got to be in that. Even if you took the right courses, you won't have enough grade point average to get in and look at that. So
I hear people say California teaches generally to UC. And then we have people who come and they see this. Maybe that's not true. I hope it's not, because that's what I hear people say. Why aren't California kids getting into Eastern colleges? Are we teaching to UC?
I know the Superintendent Rojas in San Francisco tried to align the district standards to the A through F requirements of the University of California. And number one, the teachers, really objected. But even so, there would not have been enough teachers to teach algebra. I mean, basically, I think you almost had to start teaching algebra at 7th grade. There is just not enough algebra teachers, for instance, to go around in the math, say in math, and in science is worse. So that's a problem.
yeah, why they're not getting in. Stanford takes 13% of its completed applications. So, that's pretty low, and a lot of those are very strong. So we're 13%.
13% of
Of the people who complete the application. I don't mean file an interest statement. I mean, they fill the whole thing out, write the essays, send it all in. We take 13% of that pool.
What percentage of those are California kids educated in California?
About 30 to 35%. We'd like to get that down to 12%, so we'd be perfectly nationally representative. So one of our goals for years has been to lower the California percentage.
On your point about what are high schools in California really preparing students for UC and CSU, high schools are required to provide those courses, but there was a commission on at UC looking at Hispanic students, found tremendous dispersion across high schools in the number of kids who are actually coming to UC. And it seems pretty clear that some high schools are offering far fewer sections of A-to-F courses than are others. And again, this speaks to the issue of what do we want to spend on? Do we want to spend on reducing class size or on teacher training? On your question about class size reduction and the side effects, I think you're absolutely right. There have been lots of anecdotal reports about schools losing computer classrooms and so on. I think California here has taught a lesson to the rest of the country. President Clinton and his plans to reduce class size very carefully stipulated that this is something that should be phased in. Wasn't done that way really here. And that's the way this state does everything. There's an election coming in 2 years, bang.
Yes.
I'm here as an alienated parent. I'm one of those people that I'm not in education or libraries or whatever. And I'm co-chair of the bond committee to try to build those facilities. You talk about 23 going to a smaller class size of 15. I think people from here from California
It's
would
irrelevant.
love to see 23. We're at 32 looking at 21. So I don't know if there are any studies that touch on that. And we have 60% of our kids in our school that are slipping through cracks. We pay close attention to the bottom 20%. We have great AP classes for the top 20%, and I'm involved because of that 60% that is literally falling through the cracks every single day. And I believe California discriminates against those middle 60%, and that's the problem with California education.
Just a quick comment on the class size. There have been no studies I know of that started as high as California did, with over 30. Therefore, to me, it's a really unknown what happens when you get as high as 30, and 32 and 33. So there's a gap in the research in that area. I agree with you.
There's a lot of non-experimental evidence on class size and a so-called meta-analysis, which is a synthesis of studies in the late 70s, which was very influential, argued that it's really when you get down below 15 that class size starts to matter. But on the other hand, I've seen a study of Texas school districts which argues that class size only starts to have negative effects above about 24. So you've got a long way to go.
Yes, you've.
Yeah, kind of to Mr. Kirsten, Mr. Betts, we both talked a little bit about competency testing and teacher training, further funding. I think one of the problems is that some of our teachers, just because they have the credential to pass the CPAS, doesn't make them necessarily fit to be in a classroom. So I was wondering if you could just possibly expand a little bit on that. So thank you for this.
Your question is, you want to talk about teacher training and okay.
More funding to teacher training or possibly a competency test, or what is the possibility of those becoming actual successful things happening?
Sure. Michael?
Well, I think that we're in the throes of rethinking that, and here's where all this legislative outpouring, I think, has helped this year. There's some more money and more resources. We do have a competency test, which is a 10th, 11th grade, maybe 12th grade test to enter teaching. CBEST. You're talking about one on the other end, I take it, after they're done. Yeah, and we have instituted for kindergarten through 8th grade teachers a test to teach reading. So it's just coming in. It's going to be it could be very interesting. So that if you're going to be a teacher in California, there's a new exam which examines your ability to teach reading. That's part of this categorical reform about the reading problems that we've had. So there is a movement there. The basic problem, a basic problem we've had, and I mean you can split it to pre-service teacher training, which I think the 5th year has been too short, so we're going to start building longer programs starting in the undergraduate years and then having the 5th year more of a clinical teaching experience. So the pre-service is undergoing some change. The induction of new teachers is the second phase after you're trained and you get in there. and we're expanding the beginning teacher support program. A lot of money for that. Question's not the lack of money, whether we'll have the mentor teachers to do that. And the last is the staff development programs that I addressed. So I think that we made a decision in the 60s under the late Congressman Leo Ryan that he thought up it should all be at the master's degree level. And many other states train primarily at the undergraduate level. Finally, we said, why don't we put the undergraduate together with the master's? And that just came through in the legislation which the governor signed Thursday, a week ago, actually. And I think that's very promising. Whether we'll have really strong measures of outcome before you get, and whether you can teach strong measures of what you can teach and what your content knowledge is, and have you mastered your content, there's a lot of talk of that. I think there's some hope for that, but we're still not there yet. So there is a push for it.
Julie, do you want to add?
Sure. What research seems to indicate about teacher training is that it doesn't really matter so much whether a teacher has a master's degree. What is really crucial is whether the teacher has subject mastery. So for instance, if we're going to put a teacher in a high school classroom teaching math, did that person take some math courses at university? And that seems to be far more important than whether they have a master's degree. So I don't think we want credentialism for the sake of credentials. That's extremely important. There's a school of thought that says that this move, not just in California, but around the country towards increasing credential requirements is going to have an adverse side effect, and that is decreasing the supply of people willing to go into teaching. And it makes some sense to me to combine two reforms together here. One is to fight for things such as the reading test for teachers, but at the same time, increase teacher salaries, reward people for taking courses that really matter. And this is something that Gary Hart mentioned yesterday. I don't know how many of you were there. He said, let's get away from increasing teacher salaries simply for having taken extra credits. Let's pay extra teacher salary for credits that matter. And I think that we're at a state now in California where we could do that. One other thing that I think really would help would be getting prospective teachers some classroom experience early on. There's a tremendous attrition rate, something like, half the teachers in the state leave in their first 5 years in the classroom. Giving people a feel early on in their undergraduate careers what it's like to be in a classroom really could change some people's minds in both directions, and that would be good.
Yeah, I was kind of intrigued by something that Mr. Kurtz brought up, kind of referring to the different tax structures before Prop 13 and after, kind of suggesting that the statewide control of the revenue kind of increases more equity, yet the local autonomy increases the adequacy. I'd just kind of like to pick your brains, find out your idea. Is adequacy and equity, are those opposed naturally? Do they have to be opposed, or is there a way of reconciling the two?
Yeah, they don't have to be they can be mutually compatible. You can have equity by leveling the system up and bringing it to what one would call a high adequate level, and then leveling the playing field there. You can also have some local options on top of that. Systems that do that say the state's responsibility is to provide an adequate education at a high level, equalize that. If you want to go beyond that adequacy level, that's a local tax burden. Or you can equalize down. What we did in Prop 13, I was there when we did it, is we leveled the system down to equity.
Right.
So we took the ones that were high spending, and we didn't give them as much money in the bailout. And we gave the ones that were Prop 13 bailout in 79-80. And we took the school districts that were rather low spending, and we actually increased their spending through the state bailout after Prop 13. So it was a boon to the equalizers, but we leveled generally the system down, and that's been California's solution. So over the long haul, that then leaves you solely dependent on the state for the most of the revenue generation. We do have an increasing passage of issues now, some tax add-ons locally for what are called parcel tax. But that means that the schools ride up and down with the state economy, and there's nothing to cushion that. So in the 90s, we went down like a rock in the early 90s, and now in the late 90s, we're coming up real strong, but it's all wherever the state revenue is. And so if you look at the secret of these other states, that spend considerably more, they have a balanced revenue system of state and local. And the local system is a sort of a fail-safe and a backup system when the state is going down and the local citizens don't want the system to get down the way we went down.
I'd like to add to that, because I spent a great deal of time on this adequacy equity question, both in Sacramento and in Washington. And it's really interesting. I think Michael's described the balanced system, and there's a social dimension to this that's pretty enormous and kind of ignored. And that is when we start talking about standards, raising the standards. And then you have, as you look at those standards, you have a system that is theoretically equitable. Is that adequate? In other words, are there some students in some school districts, in some cities, in some towns, that it's actually going to take more to get to that standard, more input to get to that standard than maybe in some other location? And when you start to talk about that, where do you go? And I think that that's the next frontier. At least that's a federal funding model, but it's going to be here too. Because as we talk about implementing programs, at least in districts like Los Angeles, where you have 60% of the students, or a large number, that are non-English speaking, and you want to get them to a standard that's a state standard, what's that going to cost? And the question we were talking about when the meeting first started was, certainly public education can work, but who wants to pay to fix it? I mean, there's no question in my mind that public education, it has worked historically. The question I think that we're not asking is whether or not communities are going to support the cost of public education. And the question that's sort of buried in that is when we talk about alternatives and we talk about reforms and we talk about all the other things we can do, I keep asking, what is it that we can do in these other structures that's different than we can do in the public education structure that somehow makes it magical? And I haven't been able to answer that. And it's a very interesting panel today because we have all the diversity on the panel. We have different points of view, and probably all of them work. But from a public policy perspective, what's going to stay? We have 10 charter schools in Los Angeles. And there's one characteristic that goes throughout those charter schools. The people are enthusiastic and the leadership is motivated. I wonder what would happen if I took that enthusiastic staff and that motivated leadership and put them in a regular school. It's particularly when you go back and look at the education code and understand that best kept secret in the world, unless something's changed in the last, Eleanor probably knows, we have a permissive ed code in California, which essentially says that you can do almost anything you want to, providing you don't violate collective bargaining agreements. End of story. No one talks about it. We talk about the size of the ed code, but we don't talk about the availability of the waivers on all those sections. And I guess you can waive every section in the code except for, Eleanor, help me.
They're listed.
Well, why doesn't Los Angeles ask for more waivers then?
We do. I mean, it's something no one talks about. It's really interesting to me to kind of listen to these discussions because that is a fact, and no one wants to deal with it. For reasons I don't understand. The equity, adequacy argument, the code argument, the what can non-traditional programs do that quote-unquote traditional programs can't do. And I haven't been able to get any answers to that, and I've been doing this for 40 years, 25 of it in Sacramento with the policy stuff, and I still don't know the answer to it. But I do think those are the right questions. One of the things that we're working with Michael on in Los Angeles, and it's going to be risky, and we're starting to talk about who's accountable. My salary, at least 6% of my salary is tied to, and I'm a deputy superintendent, is tied to whether or not the reading scores go up. Pretty radical, because I don't teach reading. But the institution is about that, so I have to be about that too. So my sense of all of this goes back to almost all of it will work if the people that are involved in it are accountable to someone for the results. Maybe that's simplistic, but I think in the charter schools, the things that I'm a little fearful of, not that the charter schools are great, is I don't know who they're accountable to. Yes.
I was glad, Ron, you talked a little bit about accountability because that's something we talked a great
You know, we were obviously watching the state activity closely while we were trying to do what we were doing in Los Angeles by having a task force of known experts like Michael and others come in to help us figure this out. One of the reasons for that task force, in addition to getting the obvious expertise that people with that background could bring, was we could not do this locally. In other words, the vested interest in the system as it is cannot accommodate notions of serious accountability. In other words, there are people that have reasons for wanting to keep things the way they are. In Sacramento, you have enormous interest, and it's very difficult to do. So what we want to do is go with the kind of conversation that Julian is having. We'll look at the data. And we're going to say the data indicates that we should be doing A, B, and C, phonics, for instance, and phonemic awareness and brain research and all that. Take it right to that, and then come off of that with some kind of accountability package that ties what happens to kids to some research-based reality. As opposed to what I've been doing for the last 40 years is developing policy based on anecdote, political need, and who talked to who last. We did some work with Rand Corporation way back, and some of my friends are here remember that with on educational policy and how it was formed. And the conclusion that Rand came to is that it was complete fiat. It was whoever happened to be in the room at the time the discussion was taking place. And if education is one of the most important, and Michael's thing showed it was one of the top most important things we're doing in our communities, then it's certainly the way we make educational policy doesn't match that. You know, rocket science is a better way to go. I mean, the way we make educational policy, and I speak from my own personal experience, is a joke. And so until we can get our arms around that, then obviously the charter schools become an alternative that's viable, because the policy stuff that we develop for the public schools is silly. And that's why I'm very interested in what Michael's doing and what Julian is doing in terms of looking at data, and Michael's looking at the politics of data with PACE, and coming to Sacramento, particularly with this term limit stuff, with all these new members with these fresh ideas, and actually getting them educated as they sort of develop this stuff. We've dreamed about that for a long time. We haven't been real successful at it. Michael indicated there's maybe a little success now. But I think that the public school system can be fixed. I think we have to just decide to do it. And I think it's going to take additional resources, and the whole adequacy argument is going to become a very serious one, and it's going to be controversial. But I don't think we can fix it like we're trying to fix it now. I don't think we can fix it by the widget of the day thing, or widget du jour.
Widget du jour.
And that's what we tend to do. And I wish we had more time today to go into more. Obviously, this is a subject that we could talk about for weeks. But I think we're about out of time. Time for maybe one more question. Yes, ma'am.
This is a question of Michael. I was interested in your local income tax surcharge option, and I wondered if you still had the same enthusiasm for that option as you did in '95 when you wrote this list, and whether there would be other options on that list now. And then, somewhat related, what your thinking is about the future for reducing the supermajority vote for local districts and raising income tax funds for facilities. You know, that dropped out of the package this year as a part of the facilities,
Right.
school
Well,
facilities financing reform.
yeah.
Whether you think that has a future.
Well, I think it does. The
Michael, can you
major-
repeat the question? I don't know if everyone heard her question. I didn't hear it either.
Oh, okay. The question was, what is the future of the majority vote for school bonds and taxes? And then are there options in additional local income tax for financing?
Okay.
I think the future for majority financing obviously depends on the electorate. I mean, there's a broad spectrum that supported it. The governor was for it on construction. And so you're asking me to predict the politics. in the future. So I think it's been supported by most moderate Republicans and most of the most of the Democrats. So, and then there's voting against it consistently has been a group of Republicans in the legislature who defied the governor in their own party to defeat it. So I don't know where the election's going to come out, but it has a pretty broad spectrum of support for construction. For local operating expenditures, all we can levy are parcel taxes, the same amount of money for each parcel, no matter how big or expensive the parcel is. Moving that down to a local, a majority rather than 2/3, I don't really see any momentum for that. And I think the Jarvis Group would oppose that very strongly. The local income tax is not prohibited by Prop 13. Prop 13 legislated only on property taxes. That's why we were trying to get away from running right at Prop 13 and say, let's go around the edge. Several states, Maryland, Kentucky, Ohio, use a locally voted income tax surcharge, which is then rebated back to the district. You can equalize the yield and play various financial equity games with it. So I still like it, but when you start talking about, there's nobody talking about new tax bases for California. None of the governor's candidates are. I don't hear anybody. So it's just not even discussed, and you won't get it discussed during a period of economic boom. When we get down, they begin to talk about it a little bit, and then we go back up again, and they forget about it. So that's been the history.
Thank you all very much for coming. It was fun.